All right, so our first speaker, I'll introduce each speaker as we go. Our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Longair, who's Associate Professor in the History of Empire at the University of Lincoln. For me, she's much more relevantly a former colleague from when we both worked at the British Museum, and both actually had a really interesting trip out to East Africa at one point together. And her research focuses on the history of the British Empire in East Africa and the Indian Ocean, particularly through material and visual culture. She's got a current book project on island collecting, Objects and Empire in the Western Indian Ocean, 1850 to 1930. And over to you, Sarah, for your talk today.
Thank you, Katie, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, to the organisers for an amazing event. I'm sorry, I only got here very late last night, so I missed yesterday's papers, but it's been wonderful so far and look forward to everything today. So as Katie mentioned, this work is part of a book project on island collecting. So I'm thinking about the formation of the collections in museums that we have, and particularly how the island environment influences collections, what is collected, how they were made, how do islanders and island environments influence what we find in colonial museum collections. As I said, I'm a historian of the British Empire, so I'm focusing on that period of when these collections were formed, how are local people influencing what is collected, and also, quite critically, what is not collected, which I think is important in this case. My case studies are from some of what I think are some of the overlooked corners of empire. So in my project, I'm looking at the Western Indian Ocean and 3 different island case studies. Zanzibar, so there's more work on Zanzibar, but I'm bringing that into dialogue with the Seychelles and Maldives. All archipelagos. You'll see here some geographical details about them, but very different histories, very different environments, very different ways in which insularity influences objects, islanders, and their histories. My starting point when I was working on this project was the British Museum collection, and in fact on an Indian Ocean exhibition Katie and I were curating together, which encouraged me to look closely at what Indian Ocean collections we had, what we could represent, and where were they from. And what was very striking to me was when we were thinking about Indian Ocean spaces, islands are great ways to think about the ocean, was the disparity in collections. So just focusing your attention on the left-hand column here, this was when we were looking at the British Museum collection. If you look at the objects which were made in, you can see in Zanzibar and the Maldives, there are several objects. In Zanzibar, there are many more things which are collected from there. It's a great site for reaching into the interior, but objects made in Zanzibar, there are around 300. Seychelles, there are 2, one with a question mark. And the Maldives, several. Seychelles was by far the longest period as a British territory, and yet it has this huge disparity. When I then began to look beyond the British Museum, and of course, that was my starting point, but then I was thinking about other collections. What was very striking to me was the place which had the most significant Seychelles collections in UK museums was in the Economic Botany collection in the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And obviously I'll talk more about this when I talk about the Seychelles case study. But what's very notable there is that this was a museum which collected so-called useful plants. Started in the 19th century, how could plants be made useful for empire? And they also collected material things to help them show that, things made by local people, which could then demonstrate the utility of these plants and their potential to be propagated elsewhere. It's an amazing collection. It's not now a museum anymore, but it is a collection that you can explore, and it is a fantastic and incredible source for thinking about imperial collections as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be thinking about 2 case studies, and I'm going to look at the Maldives and Seychelles to give you a flavour of how I think islands influence collecting and the making of objects in different ways. So I'm going to start take us somewhere very warm and beautiful looking from this image in the Maldives. This is an archipelago of over 1,000 islands, very small islands. And you can see here they're shaped in atolls, which are rings of islands. The actual word atoll comes from the Maldivian word atollu. Each of those with some very small islands themselves. It had been inhabited for several thousand years, and it nestles right close to the coast of the western coast of India, but it is in part isolated. And part of this is because not only physically they're isolated, but they have a network of coral channels which connect them, which made it very difficult for outside vessels to go into them. Very many European ships ran aground when they went through there. So they were a challenging environment to navigate. Maldivians navigated them very effectively. It is a sea of islands where we can see highways which they navigated in various forms of vessels between them. But for outsiders, often they avoided them. They didn't see them as places they wanted to try and visit. And also the Sultan politically tried to limit intervention. They was quite closely, they were quite careful about allowing access. So I'm going to approach some of the ideas about the Maldives through an object. One of their great arts was the making of mats like this one, a very, very beautiful fine mat making tradition. This one, they're over 2 meters, around 2 meters long. They're used as prayer mats on the islands, but also as diplomatic gifts. So they have a kind of crucial role both within society, but also as in within gift giving. They have beautiful geometric patterns, and quite typically with these line parts at the end with a square or rectangular section in the middle. What's very revealing about these mats is that they are made on the fine quality. There are various sort of qualities of mats, but the fine quality ones are made on one island on one of the atolls. So Huvadu Atoll down at the bottom here, and then within Huvadu Atoll, it is one island, Gadu Island, where these fine quality mats are made. And they're made from particular reeds and particular dyes that are available from the roots of different plants, which are present in that atoll. So on that particular region, they have developed the skills and the craftsmanship, responding very closely to the specifics of what is available on that island group. And all elements of these mats are made by women. And that it still goes on today. And mat weavers today talk about how different designs were passed on from mother to daughter, and how these kind of different patterns and skills were continue to be passed on. And what I think is interesting about this is how it reflects how artistic and insular skills were located on particular islands in the Maldives, and these were developed into specialized skills. And this was noted in European texts as early as the 17th century. Pierre de Laval was a Frenchman who was stranded on the islands after a shipwreck in the 17th century. It's quite a common theme in Maldivian history that shipwrecks cause and prompt knowledge to be produced as people spend time on the islands. And he noted the craftsmen are collected in different isles. For instance, the weavers in one, the goldsmiths, the locksmiths, the blacksmiths, the mat weavers, the potters, the turners, the carpenters in others. In short, the craftsmen do not mingle together. Each craft has its separate island. And so what's so interesting there is we therefore it has to be a connected space. It is not at all, these islands are not isolated, given that they have to exchange and move and be mobile between them to maintain, all aspects of their lives. So it is very revealing of Maldivian culture, this idea of specialization across different islands. And it was noted by observers in the late 19th century, this was still very much the case. And it was in the late 19th century that collecting in the Maldives, European collecting, really kicked off. Henry Charles Purvis Bell, an archaeologist based in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, was very interested in Maldives. He studied the Mataramut, but he instigated a greater interest in them. And a German collector, Carl Wilhelm Rosset, was commissioned to collect for the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of 1886. By the Ceylon government. It was then a dependency, the loosest form of relationship to Ceylon. And he created a significant collection, but one that was highly limited by the island environment. He traveled to the Malé, the capital island, but was told by the Sultan he couldn't travel elsewhere. The Sultan was apparently very suspicious that he might try, in his words, to hoist a flag. This really was seen as a political endeavor, and it took a lot of time to persuade him that he simply wanted to collect examples of material culture. And he never went beyond Mali. So despite amassing quite a large collection, and later in text claiming he had made a systematic investigation of the islands, this was in fact highly limited by the islands themselves. So we have from his information, we have very limited knowledge. He doesn't mention that mats were made by women, which one would have thought would be a natural thing had he been to that island to have noted. So he really, and he also published the results of his research. He made important photographs, but others noted, Bell, the sort of more committed scholar of the Maldives, noted this had several errors and didn't actually recognize the aid of islanders that had been so significant in enabling him to create these collections. So he presented over 300 objects at the Colonial Indian exhibition, but I think we can really see how closely the island environment and the islanders influenced that collection. And now in this brief time, I'm going to race us over to Seychelles just to give you a flavour of that case study, to kind of draw a comparison in the way that the islands influence these collections. And Seychelles is quite a different landscape, as you can see. But what's so important here is that it was uninhabited before the French settled there in the late 18th century. It was probably known about by Indian Ocean mariners, but there was no settlement. The French, when they settled, brought enslaved Africans as a labour force to aid them on the islands, and it handed to the British in 1810. But it was this lack of an indigenous population, which was why it was not collected. And this is something Wayne Modest has observed with the Caribbean. He says, we are not ancient or modern enough. This displaced community were not deemed indigenously interesting. So that population was not collected. We do have some very significant and important few objects which record these peoples. This is a water carrier in the Horniman Museum, which I think, have looked into the details, may well have been made by the enslaved community, the formerly enslaved African community. And so that makes it a really important object. It's made from the coco de mer, and it is the coco de mer as a unique island species that is what captured the interest of the British. It was not the people there, it was the plants, it was the botany. And the coco de mer was a unique double-lobed coconut. You can see an example of a whole one here. The coco de mer had been known about for some time because its nuts fell off the trees in Seychelles, drifted to the bottom where the flesh disintegrated and then floated around the ocean. So they were found for centuries before Seychelles had been encountered and formally reported by Europeans, as far as the Maldives, in Southeast Asia even, and were hugely valuable. The name, you can see Maldiceae maldivica, connects it to the Maldives rather than Seychelles. But this object is actually a really important. Local people put it to great use. I discussed this in my paper in more detail, but every part of the plant was used. They made pillows, they made drain pipes, they made whole houses out of the coco de mer. And these, but yet very few of these examples used by local people, by the African community, survive. These are just the only two examples I find of coco de mer objects made by the African community in British collections, both these kind of water carriers. There were some other objects made from the coco de mer by the French community, which are these very intriguing fancy baskets, which were made from the young leaves of the plant. And there's a very striking example here, and the records, when I dug into the Kew records, they explained that these were made by women who were French women who were, in their words, in quotes, suffering from the emancipation of the enslaved community. So they're trying to say, we should feel sorry for these people. They are trying to survive by making this, when in fact they had survived very well on the exploitation of enslaved labor for many decades. But they were trying to find a new way to make money, and they were making these fancy baskets. So, and then, you know, I'm going to have to be quick, but there becomes a concern about the extinction of the palm. It was unique to Seychelles. Scientists at Kew wanted to preserve it, but islanders were using it naturally. It was a small island. They needed to survive. So they needed to try to use whatever they could, quite understandably. But there was also this pressure, what if this plant becomes extinct? It took 100 years for a palm to grow. No one could reap what they sowed. So there was a real tension around these objects in these baskets because the pressure of imperial science wanting to preserve that alongside a small island colony trying to survive. So we see these objects really sit at that tension of what is going on that small islands can reveal to us. So to conclude, I think there's, as you can tell, this is a whole book project squished into 15 minutes. So thank you for your patience with this. What I've tried to show with this is how islands and islanders exert their influence upon colonial collections. The environment determines the type of objects made, the way that people interacted and they used that environment. We can also see critically the limits that the island placed on collecting, both when islanders were not of interest, an absence of collecting, or the way that they carefully limited and controlled what objects were collected. And we can see how these islands were connected to each other in the case of the Maldives, but also the legacies of enslavement, displacement in the creation of such objects as they were in the Seychelles. I will leave it there because I'm 16 seconds over. So thank you very much.